All right, welcome to section 3 of chapter 19 covering World War One. In this one, we're going to talk about what's going on at home during the war. So, the big ideas are how did Wilson's control over the economy and government dictate changes in American society? How would you describe the important role of propaganda? And then, 3, what did the war change, or how did the war change the social structure of the United States? So let's look at first the War Industries Board. At this time, Congress had given Wilson a increase in power to deal with all of the war measures. Now remember, Congress tends to move really slow. So during a time of a lot of change and movement, like a war, they gave increased amount of power to Wilson, so he didn't have to go through them all the time. And so what he did is create the War Industries Board as one of the many things. And the goal of this board was to encourage companies to use mass production to increase efficiency and eliminate waste. The goal is to produce as much as you can, as fast as you can. It was established in 1917 and later reorganized by Bernard Baruch, and that's who this guy is right here. He's an example of, someone who's really focused on the war effort. It was helped increase industrial production by 20% in the United States, so it made huge gains. The problem is they controlled prices, so retail prices soared of things, and so did wages and corporate profits. But because prices soared, wages were pretty much parallel with what prices were soaring. And so they were only a series of, many organizations at this time that are regulating the economy. So at this time right here, you can see the average income is soaring because there is, increased production. The prices of things are going up, which is why there's an increase in the consumer price index here. Things are becoming more expensive. But that's okay at this time because there's more money going around. Wages increased especially for blue-collar workers who are working in metal trades like shipbuilding. Prices of food and housing rose. And like I said last time, this was canceling out the wage increases. The only problem was if you didn't have a huge enough increase that was proportional to the rise that in cost of goods, then you could be at a disadvantage. At the same time, union membership soared. And you have the National War Labor Board in 1918 that's created. And their goal is to deal with the many strikes that are breaking out at this time during the war effort. And one of the things they do is they improve factory conditions, they eliminate child labor, they push for an 8-hour workday. But then at the same time, those who refused to obey their decisions lost their draft exemption. And your choice was either you work or you fight. Another thing Wilson also created was the Food Administration, and this was headed by Hoover, which we'll talk about when the Great Depression comes around. And some of the initiatives was the gospel of the clean plate, so the idea that don't make more food than you can eat, only make enough for you and your family. Anything else should be left to be sold or shipped overseas. He also started a series of campaigns where one day you would have a meatless meal, one day would be sweetless, 2 days of the week would be wheatless, so you're not having bread, and 2 days would be porkless. The idea that, consume less food so we have more to export and more to ship to our soldiers when they're eventually over there. Restaurants were also on board. They removed the sugar bowls. They served bread after the first course, so you would be full and eat less. People around cities planted victory gardens at their homes and in public places to grow vegetables for themselves instead of buying them. And then government increased the price of wheat, so farmers were encouraged to plant more meat. And as a result, food shipments to the Allied tripled because we were producing more and eating less, so we had more to export. So then who's paying for all these different things? Well, the US government total spent $35.5 billion on the entire war effort. And the government got the money from they instituted graduated income tax, where the more money you made, the more taxes you paid. And remember, this idea came from our friends, the populists, as something that they wanted to instill but never did. The government also instituted a war profits tax. There were higher taxes on tobacco, liquor, and luxury goods because at this time it was seen as anything you didn't need to get by was a luxury, and you didn't really have time for that in the war effort, nor was there enough money to go around. They also issued Liberty loans and victory bonds, the idea being that you would be very patriotic, as seen in this propaganda cartoon here, if you gave the money to the government as a loan or a bond, and then after a certain amount of time, you can trade in your bond and you get more money back with interest. So it is a saving plan for money, but it also gives the government an increase in funds and capital that they can use instantly. Propaganda. This is a huge idea of World War I here, and propaganda is biased communication designed to influence people's thought and actions. And this came up through the Committee on Public Information, which was created to really get Americans invigorated by the war. And the Committee on Public Information hired artists, cartoonists, sculptors, writers to promote the war effort. These are just a few examples here of propaganda scene. There's actual written documents. There's sculptures put up. These posters are put around cities. They also recruited 75,000 what they called 4-minute men to travel and talk about anything on the war, from the draft to how successful we are or how Britain needs our help. And these were highly effective. It's important to know that propaganda was highly effective. And it was used on two fronts. First, the British used propaganda to really invigorate Americans against the Germans. And they really manipulated the American public into believing that Germans were bad and they were good. And they did this through a series of campaigns. They also let us in on the Zimmerman Note, which we talked about last section. And, this was a way to really turn Americans against the Germans. And then second, the U.S. government used it to really unite Americans behind a patriotic ideal. This example here is the most famous, which most people associate with World War II because it becomes very famous there, but it actually came out in World War I, the "I want you" for the U.S. Army. And this is the best example of propaganda that there is out there at the time. So, propaganda also ushers in an anti-immigrant backlash. At this time, you have backlash in the form of workers with German-sounding last name were getting fired, orchestra and people refused to play German music, schools stopped teaching German towns with names that were German or German-sounding changed the name of their town. There were violence against German Americans. The hamburger, which comes from Hamburg, Germany, was changed to the Liberty Sandwich. The idea that there's a huge patriotic and nationalistic pride. You also have an initiative by the government, which is the Espionage and Sedition Acts. And at this time, it's a two-part act that if a person was convicted, they could face 20 years in prison and $10,000 in fines. And you could be convicted of being or saying things disloyal to the country that were profane or abusive against the government. This is a key idea because the First Amendment is not applied as it is today. During the time of war in World War I, the First Amendment was not as it is used today. You could not talk back about the government. And at this time, the results are it violated what we think the First Amendment covered. People like socialists, anarchists, or labor leaders like Eugene Debs were sent to prison because they talked about the government in a negative way. And it led to more than, that should say, 2,000 convictions there. So it was pretty prolific around the United States at this time. The best example is the Scheck versus the United States case in 1919. Charles Scheck was a U.S. socialist, and he distributed leaflets calling the draft a deed against humanity, that it would, force boys into fighting other boys across the world. And this really violated the Sedition Act, and he went to prison. He said this act, the Alien Sedition Act, violated his freedom of speech, which is the First Amendment, remember, and the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court upheld the conviction. That's very important to know. And it led to the idea that the First Amendment has limitations. It's limited. In ordinary times, the First Amendment, and this is the Chief Justice here, and this is him, what he's quoted saying. In ordinary times, the First Amendment maybe would have protected him, but in wartime, it was another story. And this is the best example given because, protection of freedom of speech does not allow you to say fire in a crowded theater. So the idea that you have freedom of speech, you have the ability to talk about what you want, but you don't have virtual freedom of speech. You can't put someone else's life in danger. Or in a wartime, you can't talk against your government. And this precedent used today that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, putting others at risk, is still a precedent used in the judicial system. So what's going on at this time with African Americans? Well, you have a great migration, and at this time, what it is it's a large-scale movement of African Americans in the southern states that are moving to northern cities where there's industry, job, or they're moving west. And they do this for a series of reasons. One is they're leaving the Jim Crow laws in the South to avoid discrimination. They're also leaving because World War I limited European immigration, and there were many, many job opportunities for them. We also have increased manufacturing at this time, and as a result, they needed new laborers, and so Northerners sent a series of recruiters to the South to recruit black workers because Northern industries knew they could pay them low wages and they're very hard workers. The idea here, though, is that they're the last hired. It's after all the men go to fight in the war that the African Americans are hired, and as soon as the men get back, they're the first fired. So they really embody this campaign slogan, which is the last hired, first fired. Women at this time are also moving up in American status because of the war. Women left, their roles as just mothers or stay-at-home moms. They continued to embody female jobs like being a teacher, a mother, or a secretary, but they also in increasing numbers worked in factories. And this is a great example here of a woman who's working in a weapons factory to produce weapons that we would either send to our soldiers or sell to the Allied forces. The problem is they did not get equal pay. Either did African Americans. They did not make the same that a white male would have made at this time. Women, if you remember from our last segment, also could serve as nurses for the Army Corps, but they could not fight on the front lines. And because of this, finally, women are gaining support, and in 1919, the 19th Amendment is ratified, it is passed through the House of Representatives, which means it went to vote in the states. And in 1920, it was voted and passed, which means ratified. It was added to the Constitution, giving women the right to vote for the first time ever. So finally, in 1920, all citizens of the United States, regardless of their race or gender, had the right to vote. Finally, at this time, the Spanish flu epidemic is happening, and it affected both the Central Powers and the Triple Entente. And, in America alone, it's caused what they believe close to 500,000 deaths. It shut down cities and industries as, workers were catching the Spanish flu and dying from it or debilitated, unable to work. The poor who couldn't afford to bury their family members were left in the street, so there was an increased hygiene problem throughout major cities. This disappeared by 1919, so it's kind of a mystery as to where it comes from and it takes its course. But historians have estimated that 30 million people worldwide died as a result of the Spanish flu during, the short time of the World War I. So not only do you have millions and millions of people dying as casualties of the war, but you also have close to 30 million dying as a result of the Spanish flu. So what did we learn? First, that Wilson had complete control over the government and economy. He created a series of programs to make sure that America was operating as efficiently as possible and giving, many incentives to do so. Then we Then we have propaganda, which first the Brits used to really get the Americans on their side for the war. And then once the U.S. enters the war effort, they use it as a way to promote nationalistic pride, patriotism, and the idea that, you should really support the efforts outlined by Wilson in his various programs and organizations to help the war effort. And then third, how did the war change the social structure of the United States? You have the great migration of African Americans moving to the north. You have women and African Americans at greater numbers in jobs that they wouldn't normally be. And then you have the Spanish flu epidemic, which is, changing the landscape of American society as people rich to poor are getting infected and dying. So it's really having a high turnover in the population rate. We'll talk more about this in class, but this is it for now. Until next time, Husky historians.